In the year 1852, when the air in southern Alabama was thick with the hum of cicadas and the dust of horse-drawn wagons, a man named Nathaniel Crowhaven arrived in Wilcox County with a ledger full of Virginia wealth and a heart set on conquest, not of men, but of the earth itself. He was a tall, deliberate man, with a manner that demanded silence and a stare that weighed heavier than words. Nathaniel purchased 200 acres of land that locals claimed no white man had ever owned. A stretch of wilderness where the soil was rich but restless, where trees grew in twisted patterns as though shaped by unseen hands. The Creek people who had once lived there spoke of the land as sacred, a resting ground for their dead, a threshold between the living and the forgotten. But by the time Nathaniel signed his name, those voices had been long silenced, and their burial mounds were just humps in the earth that his workers soon leveled for ploughing. The Crowhaven estate began as a symbol of southern ambition, a grand house of brick and timber rising from the red clay like a monument to pride. Yet even in its infancy, there was something unnatural about it. The builders complained that their tools broke without reason, that their animals refused to cross certain sections of the property, that the air turned cold when the sun dipped below the trees. One worker, a freedman named Isaiah, claimed to have found bones, small, human bones, near the foundations, arranged in deliberate circles as if meant for some ritual. Nathaniel dismissed it as nonsense and buried the remains elsewhere, though he kept one of the bones, a curved fragment of a jaw, in a glass cabinet in his study. From that day forward, he was said to have developed an obsession with the unseen, a quiet fascination with death, heritage, and the thin line that divided both. By autumn, the Crowhaven house stood complete, 4 stories tall, with a veranda that wrapped around its entire frame and columns painted the color of bone. Travelers passing by on the river road said it looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum waiting for its dead. Nathaniel's wife, Eliza, arrived weeks later, pale from the journey and already uneasy about their new life. In her letters to her sister in Virginia, she wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing distant drumming from the woods, of windows that rattled when no wind blew. Locals began to whisper that the land itself rejected the Crowhavens, that the soil still belonged to the dead it once sheltered. Yet Nathaniel only grew more determined, planting his first field of cotton on the very ground the Creek tribes had called forbidden. That first crop, though lush, was said to reek faintly of decay, and when it was harvested, the pickers reported that their hands burned as though from invisible nettles. The years that followed marked both prosperity and quiet dread. The Crowhaven name became synonymous with wealth in Wilcox County, but the family's isolation deepened. Nathaniel refused to attend church, claiming that the Lord was present enough on his own land. His workers whispered of strange lights at night, pale lanterns drifting through the fields when the master was away. One night in 1856, lightning struck the north barn, burning it to the ground and killing 2 horses. When the ashes cooled, the bodies were found positioned upright, their eyes wide open, their mouths filled with soil. Nathaniel forbade anyone to speak of it and had the area fenced off. From that point on, the fields nearest the ruins never bore fruit again, no matter how many times they were replanted. By the end of the decade, the Crowhaven's prosperity had turned hollow. The grand house began to smell of damp and rot despite endless attempts at cleaning. Visitors often complained of nausea or dizziness after entering, as though the air itself resisted them. When a local preacher came to bless the property, he left abruptly after entering Nathaniel's study, muttering that the walls listened too closely. Eliza grew frail and nervous, often seen pacing the veranda at dawn, whispering under her breath to no one visible. Nathaniel, meanwhile, kept meticulous records of every odd occurrence, the sudden deaths of livestock, the unseasonal blooms, the dreams that repeated among servants, all logged in what he called his family ledger. The entries began orderly, factual, but as the years passed, his handwriting changed, jagged, fevered, filled with symbols instead of words. The estate that began as a declaration of wealth had, by 1860, become something else entirely. The cotton fields grew patchy and pale, the air hung heavy with unease, and travelers began to avoid the road altogether. Some said they could still see a figure standing by the fence after midnight, tall, motionless, dressed in black, his hat pulled low. Those who claimed to have looked closer swore they saw nothing where his face should have been, only a deep, hollow shadow where eyes ought to be. Eliza Crowhaven was never meant for the southern heat or the silence that came with it. But when she arrived at the estate in the spring of 1853, she carried herself with the fragile composure of a woman trying to honor her husband's ambitions. She was 28, fair-skinned, and refined in a way that made her presence on the rough Alabama soil feel misplaced, almost spectral. Locals described her as polite but distant, her speech marked by the soft Virginia drawl that faded whenever she grew frightened, which was often. The servants whispered that she rarely slept through the night, that she could be heard wandering the halls barefoot, murmuring prayers to a god she seemed certain had abandoned her. Within months, her letters home grew strange, filled not with accounts of social visits or weather, but with cryptic references to sounds beneath the floorboards and faces glimpsed in the mirrors. Her handwriting, once delicate and even, began to slant. The ink smudged, as if her hand trembled while she wrote. Nathaniel told neighbors she was unwell from the climate, but those who worked in the house knew better. Something inside Eliza had begun to unravel. Her decline began quietly, like a slow fever that deepens unnoticed. At first, she complained of hearing footsteps above her room, though no one else slept on that floor. Then came the voices, low, indistinct, and persistent, as though whispering through the walls. She claimed they came from the very timbers of the house, from the wood that had been cut from the cursed land itself. Nathaniel dismissed it as womanly hysteria, a term that rolled easily off his tongue, but her terror only grew sharper. Servants reported finding her seated in the parlor long after midnight, staring at the fireplace, lips moving silently. On more than one occasion, she was found speaking to an empty rocking chair, pausing between sentences as if someone were replying. When Nathaniel demanded to know what she heard, she said only that the voices were not cruel, just waiting. After that, he forbade her from speaking of them, and she obeyed outwardly, though her eyes began to drift toward the corners of every room, as if tracking something unseen. In 1855, when the summer heat was at its cruelest, Eliza locked herself in her chamber for 3 full days. The servants heard her pacing, laughing softly, then crying without pause. On the 4th day, she emerged calm, serene even, her hair uncombed and her nightdress streaked with soot. She told Nathaniel she had found peace, that the voices were children of the soil, and that they meant her no harm. He took this as a sign of recovery, but her behavior grew only stranger. She began placing small bowls of milk and honey in the corners of rooms, claiming it kept the hungry ones from entering her dreams. When the servants tried to remove them, she screamed so violently that Nathaniel ordered everyone to leave her rituals undisturbed. From that point on, the Crowhaven home carried the faint scent of curdled milk and honey, an odor that lingered no matter how often the maids scrubbed the floors. By the late 1850s, Eliza's isolation had become complete. She stopped writing letters, stopped attending church, and rarely left the house. Her reflection, some said, did not always move in time with her body. One maid swore she saw Eliza standing at the upstairs window, while also sitting quietly at the dining table below, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Others spoke of the sound of humming coming from the attic, even when Eliza was known to be asleep. Nathaniel, now consumed by his own fascination with death and legacy, kept her confinement private. He refused to let doctors near her, insisting that she was merely attuned to the land. The only person allowed to visit her regularly was a young servant named Ruth, who would later describe the room as unbearably cold, the walls damp, the smell of soil and old roses heavy in the air. She said Eliza's eyes had turned glassy, her skin nearly translucent, and that she often whispered names that did not belong to anyone living. As the war loomed closer, the Crowhaven estate seemed to sink into a deeper stillness, and Eliza's mind with it. She began drawing symbols in chalk on the floorboards, circles, spirals, and patterns that resembled ancient sigils. She claimed they kept them from taking her children, though she had none at the time. When Nathaniel asked who they were, she simply smiled, a slow, empty smile that made even him recoil. On stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the Alabama hills, the servants said they could hear her singing lullabies in a language no one recognized, the melody rising and falling like a prayer and a warning both. The next morning, her windows would be open, curtains soaked from rain, and dirt scattered across the floor as though something had entered from outside. Nathaniel ordered the windows nailed shut after that, but the singing never stopped. By 1862, the war had taken most of the county's men, but the Crowhaven mansion remained untouched, standing like a relic of both wealth and sickness. Eliza no longer left her room at all. Her food was left at the door, and when the servants returned to retrieve the tray, they found strange offerings left behind, dead birds arranged neatly, or handfuls of wet clay shaped like human faces. The few who dared peek through the keyhole said she sat motionless by the window, her hair covering her face, her lips moving silently as though reciting to an unseen congregation. At night, lights flickered in her room even after all candles had been removed. Nathaniel began keeping her existence a secret, claiming she had gone to live with relatives in Virginia, but those who worked the fields swore they saw her at dusk, standing near the old well behind the house, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim light, her hands pressed against the ground, as if listening for the voices that had called her name from the beginning. When Henry Crowhaven returned to Alabama in the spring of 1874, the war had already stripped him of everything that once resembled youth. He was 32, though his face bore the wear of a man twice that age, his body marked by the long scars of both blade and fire. He arrived at the Crowhaven estate alone, walking the last few miles from the river road after abandoning his horse, claiming the animal refused the land. The townsfolk said he looked like something dragged up from the grave, his eyes sunken, his uniform filthy but still buttoned with soldierly precision. Nathaniel Crowhaven, now a shadow of his former self, greeted his son with a pride tainted by fear. There was something in Henry's stare that unsettled him, a glint of calculation, of silent knowing, as if he had brought something back from the battlefields that refused to stay buried. From that day on, the air around the estate grew heavier, as though his arrival had awakened what had been sleeping beneath its soil. Henry kept mostly to himself in those first months, haunting the property like a restless spirit. He was often seen walking the perimeter of the fields at dusk, his boots sinking deep into the clay, his head tilted slightly as though listening for something beneath his feet. Servants avoided him, saying he spoke softly to the ground, whispering in tones too low to understand. He converted one of the back barns into a workspace, forbidding anyone to enter. The first thing he brought inside was an old embalming table, scavenged from a burned-out church in Montgomery. Then came the jars, dozens of them, filled with alcohol, oil, and strange brown liquid that gave off a sour stench. When asked what he intended to do with them, he said only that he was restoring what time had stolen. It was the beginning of what locals would later call the Restoration House, a name whispered with unease and always followed by the sign of the cross. At night, lights flickered through the cracks of the barn's wood, and a low humming sound could be heard drifting over the fields. The sound was not mechanical, but rhythmic, human, almost like chanting. One field hand swore he heard the squeal of an animal cut short by the sharp thud of metal. The next morning, the same man found the head of a goat nailed to the barn door, its eyes replaced with glass marbles. When Nathaniel confronted his son, Henry told him it was a preservation experiment, but his tone carried no remorse. Nathaniel demanded he end his work, yet his authority over his son had long vanished. Henry's calm defiance unsettled him more than rage ever could. The old man withdrew further into the decaying mansion, while the barn became a place no one dared approach after dark. As the weeks passed, the odor from the Restoration House grew unbearable, a mixture of rotting flesh and chemical sweetness that clung to the air even during rain. Henry, however, seemed transformed by it. His skin grew pale, his hands perpetually stained with something dark and sticky. He began keeping meticulous notes in small leather journals, filled with sketches of human anatomy and passages copied from scripture twisted to suit his theories of resurrection. He believed, or claimed to, that death was not an ending but a delay, a disruption in nature's pattern that could be corrected by will and ritual. He spoke of reanimating memory, of preserving the soul within the vessel. The servants called him mad, but Nathaniel, perhaps out of guilt or curiosity, allowed him to continue. The Crowhaven property, already avoided by most, now radiated an air of quiet dread that even birds seemed to sense, their songs ceasing near the barn. By late summer, Henry's work took a darker turn. He began asking after small animals from the fields, offering the workers coin for stray dogs or livestock that had died. When none complied, animals began disappearing anyway. Chickens, cats, even a calf from the neighbor's pasture. One night, a servant named Ruth, the same who once cared for Eliza, claimed to see movement through the barn's high window. Not Henry, but something taller, shifting slowly, its outline flickering in the lantern light. She fled before she could be sure of what she had seen. The next morning, she found fresh soil piled behind the barn in neat mounds, each marked with a stone. Henry said nothing about them, and Nathaniel no longer asked. When autumn came, the smell from the barn lessened, but not because the work had ceased. Henry had sealed the walls with tar, trapping the odor and whatever else inside. He began wearing gloves at all times, even to meals, and his right eye twitched uncontrollably when anyone mentioned his mother's name. Rumor spread that he had begun experimenting on more than animals, that he had purchased unclaimed corpses from the nearby infirmary through bribes and threats. The local doctor disappeared around this time, his horse found wandering near the river, the saddle cut clean through. Henry said he had gone north, but the sheriff who searched his home found nothing except a peculiar silence that clung to every surface, as though sound itself avoided the place. As winter settled in, no one saw Henry for weeks. The barn remained locked, the windows blacked out. Then, on a cold morning in December, a single candle burned in its window for 3 days straight. When Nathaniel finally forced his way inside, he found the interior stripped bare except for a table covered in glass jars. Each jar held what appeared to be preserved animal hearts, labeled with dates and names, some of which matched the family's former servants. In the center of the room was a crude wooden figure, human in shape, bound in wire, its face carved into a grotesque imitation of life. Nathaniel collapsed at the sight, muttering prayers that broke into sobs. From that day on, the barn was sealed again, its door chained shut, though the faint smell of oil and decay continued to seep through the cracks long after Henry vanished from sight. When Henry Crowhaven took Abigail for his wife in 1876, the union was spoken of in hushed tones across Wilcox County. She was his cousin on his mother's side, a pale and quiet woman from Mobile with fine features and the kind of gaze that seemed to look through rather than at anyone. The marriage had been arranged under the guise of preserving the family's name, though some suspected there was more beneath it, something darker that tied blood to blood, not out of duty but desire. Their wedding was held on the grounds of the decaying Crowhaven estate, beneath the same dying oak where Nathaniel had once buried the remnants of his fortune in silver coin. Only a handful of witnesses attended, 2 servants, the county clerk, and an itinerant preacher who refused payment afterward and rode out before dusk without a word. Those who saw the ceremony later said the air turned cold during the vows, and when Henry slipped the ring onto Abigail's hand, the candle flames guttered as if pulled by a breath that came from nowhere. Within weeks of the marriage, the house seemed to recognize its new mistress, though not with warmth. Abigail settled uneasily into the home, her movements soft and deliberate, her voice rarely raised above a whisper. She carried a faint scent of lilac wherever she went, a fragrance that soon became the only sweet thing in that rotting place. But she too began to change. At night, she joined Henry in the outbuilding he called his study, the same barn that once held his experiments. Servants claimed to hear 2 voices murmuring in low rhythm until dawn, the occasional metallic clatter breaking the stillness. When one of them dared to look through a crack in the wood, they saw Abigail holding a lantern while Henry leaned over a table, his hands moving with careful precision. What she saw next sent her running, the outline of a small body laid bare on the table, and Abigail smiling faintly as though in reverence. After that night, the remaining servants fled, leaving only the couple and the silent rooms that had watched generations wither within their walls. By the following spring, Abigail was with child. Henry's demeanor softened in public, but grew more intense in private. He spoke of perfection through continuation, of crafting purity from blood untainted by outsiders. His journals from that year, later found beneath the floorboards of his study, were filled with sketches of fetuses, mathematical equations, and cryptic diagrams of human bone. Abigail's pregnancy, however, was not ordinary. She suffered fevers that came in waves, her skin turning almost translucent, her eyes ringed with violet shadows. Midwives from town refused to attend her after one visit, claiming she did not sleep like the living. When the time came, she gave birth alone in her room, and for 2 days the house echoed with her screams, followed by a silence so deep it made the air itself feel heavy. On the 3rd morning, Henry emerged carrying a swaddled infant with eyes described as dark as the well behind the house. No one outside the family saw the child again. The years that followed blurred into one another, marked only by the quiet arrival of two more children. Each birth left Abigail weaker, her once bright presence fading into something spectral. The children were seldom seen, though those who glimpsed them from a distance described them as unnervingly still, their movements slow and measured, their expressions eerily calm. They did not attend church or school, and no one could recall ever hearing them cry. When a census taker visited in 1880, Henry claimed his children were delicate and needed protection from sunlight. The man left unsettled, swearing that as he walked away from the estate, he heard faint laughter drifting from the upper windows, laughter that did not sound entirely human. Inside the mansion, the family lived in seclusion. The walls darkened with mildew, and the air carried the dampness of a tomb. Henry taught the children himself, using books filled with archaic symbols and diagrams that no one outside the house understood. Abigail grew thinner, her beauty warped into something hollow and haunted. She began painting on the walls, crude, childlike figures holding hands beneath a black sun. Henry never stopped her, claiming it was ancestral memory expressing itself. The paintings grew until they covered entire hallways, their forms twisting with each passing month. Some claimed to see them move at night when the candlelight flickered, though no one who worked there stayed long enough to prove it. By 1885, the Crowhaven home was more a mausoleum than a residence. Abigail no longer spoke in coherent sentences, only in fragments that sounded like prayers or incantations. The children roamed the halls barefoot, whispering to one another in an invented language that echoed eerily in the silence. They were often found near the sealed barn, pressing their palms against the door as if listening for something within. When a neighbor came to deliver supplies one evening, he reported seeing Abigail standing by the window, her hand resting gently on the glass, her reflection absent from it. Henry, gaunt and sleepless, met him at the door with the distant courtesy of a man long separated from reality. Then, in 1889, the family vanished. No carriage left the property, no notice was sent to town. When authorities finally investigated months later, the house was empty, yet the dinner table had been set for 5, plates arranged neatly, food spoiled in place. Upstairs, the children's beds were made, their toys aligned in perfect symmetry. On the walls, the painted figures now formed a continuous circle, hands joined, eyes open, mouths wide as if mid-song. In Abigail's room, her nightdress lay folded on the bed beside a lock of pale hair and a jar containing what appeared to be a small heart, perfectly preserved in clear fluid. The sheriff ordered the house closed, but locals claimed that on certain nights, when the air turned damp and still, the faint sound of a lullaby drifted from its empty windows, sung in a voice that was both woman and child at once. The disappearance of the Crowhaven family in 1889 sent a ripple of dread through Wilcox County that lingered like a sickness no one could name. For weeks, no one dared to approach the property, not even the sheriff, who claimed his deputies refused to cross the river road after sundown. The Crowhaven house stood silent beneath a sagging sky, its shutters half torn, its chimneys breathing faint smoke, though no one lived within. The only sound was the creak of the wind through its rotted eaves and the distant rustle of crows that had begun to gather in impossible numbers on the roof. When a group of men from town finally mustered the courage to enter, led by Deputy Morgan Hill, they found the front door unlocked, swinging open as if waiting. Inside, the air was thick and stale, sweet with the rot of old wood and something far less natural. Dust lay undisturbed on every surface, except for a narrow trail of footprints that led from the dining room to the stairs, small and bare, fading before they reached the upper landing. The house was in perfect disarray, not ransacked, not abandoned, but frozen mid-breath, as though the family had simply vanished between one heartbeat and the next. On the dining table sat 5 plates, each still bearing the remnants of a meal untouched by insects or decay. The candles beside them burned down to wax puddles. The walls bore new marks, fresh carvings of strange sigils etched with something sharp, each symbol radiating outward from the shape of a circle. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, sheets crisp, though the smell of something metallic lingered faintly in the air. In one of the children's rooms, a dollhouse had been left open on the floor, its miniature furniture arranged exactly like the rooms below, except for the tiny painted figures lying face down inside. No one spoke as they searched, for the silence of the house felt alive, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats, until each man swore he could hear it behind his own ribs. In the nursery, Deputy Hill found 3 small handprints smeared on the window pane, the marks too high for a child to have made unless lifted. The prints were not of blood, as he first feared, but of a fine, reddish clay, the same soil that surrounded the estate's oldest well behind the barn. When they stepped outside to investigate, the air changed, cooling sharply, the scent of damp earth rising from the ground. The barn stood chained shut, its boards warped from years of moisture, but faint scratches lined its door as if something inside had tried to claw its way out. They broke the lock and entered. The light from their lanterns revealed a room stripped bare, save for a single object in the center, a table draped in mold-blackened cloth. Beneath it, they found the bones of small animals arranged in circles, their skulls facing inward, their rib cages filled with dried flowers. The discovery unsettled even the most hardened among them, but it was what lay beyond that ended the search. Behind the table was a narrow trapdoor, half buried beneath straw. When opened, it exhaled a stench so foul that one of the men vomited before descending. The space below was not a cellar but a tunnel, dug crudely into the earth, the walls shored up with splintered wood. The air was damp and close, and somewhere in the dark, water dripped in slow, rhythmic intervals. They followed the tunnel until it ended in a chamber no larger than a stable stall. There, by the flicker of their lanterns, they saw jars lined against the wall, dozens of them filled with clear liquid and shapes too distorted to name. Some held animal parts, others something disturbingly human. On the ground lay a child's shoe, its leather worn but its buckle gleaming. Etched into the packed earth beside it were more of those circular carvings, their lines blackened as though burned in. None of the men spoke, but they all left with the same impression, that the family had not fled the property at all. The sheriff sealed the estate within the week, forbidding anyone to enter, but stories spread faster than law could silence them. Travelers passing along the river road reported seeing faint lights glowing behind the windows, slow-moving shadows that never left the upper floor. Some said they heard a woman calling softly for her children, her voice carried on the wind long after midnight. Others claimed to see figures walking along the property's edge, 3 small shapes and 1 taller, their outlines blurred as if moving through mist. The townspeople began leaving offerings at the crossroads. Bread, coins, salt, superstitions whispered to keep the Crowhaven curse from following them home. Years passed, and the land consumed what was left of the house. Vines crept over its face, shutters fell, the roof caved in under the weight of rain. By the time the 20th century arrived, little remained but stone and silence. Yet those who ventured too close spoke of strange sensations, a pressure in the chest, a humming in the ears, an overwhelming feeling of being watched from the tree line. The old well behind the barn, once filled with red clay, had become a pool of black water that never froze, no matter how cold the winters grew. Hunters found animal carcasses arranged neatly around it, their bodies untouched by scavengers. Locals said it was the Crowhaven children who did it, still wandering, still playing their silent games beneath the soil. Even now, when the fog rolls across that part of Alabama, the shape of the old house can sometimes be seen through the mist, windows glowing faintly, doors open, the faint echo of laughter drifting from rooms that have long since fallen to ruin. When investigators returned to the Crowhaven estate in 1899, after a series of new sightings and unexplained lights, what they found beneath the floorboards told a story far more terrifying than disappearance or madness. The house, long abandoned and half reclaimed by ivy, leaned against the weight of time like an exhausted creature. Its roof sagged, its windows were teethless holes, and yet there was something alive about it still, a hum, faint but constant, rising from its bones. The team, led by a county inspector named Elias Ward, entered cautiously, marking each step as if afraid the floor might breathe beneath them. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in lazy spirals as though stirred by unseen movement. On the ground floor, the walls were etched with symbols, the same looping marks described by the sheriff years before, now deeper, blackened, and newly cut. The air reeked of sulfur and damp, and in certain corners the wood felt warm, pulsing faintly under the palm like a heartbeat caught in timber. They began their search in what had once been Henry's study, where the stench was strongest. The wallpaper had peeled away entirely, revealing planks scrawled with a language that resembled scripture but made no sense. The furniture had rotted, yet on the desk lay an open book that had resisted time, its pages untouched by decay, its ink dark and glistening as if freshly written. Inside were diagrams of human figures split into geometric patterns, annotations about vital resonance, and a recurring phrase repeated over a dozen pages: "The vessel remembers." Ward, a man of rational mind, closed the book and ordered it sealed for later study, though his hands shook visibly. As the men pried up floorboards to check for structural damage, their crowbars struck something hollow beneath. When they lifted the boards, they found shallow cavities filled with ash and bone fragments, small, delicate, unmistakably human. Each cavity was lined with a ring of symbols, their grooves filled with dried blood that flaked at the touch. The house was not merely the scene of death, it had been built, it seemed, to feed upon it. As they dug deeper, the floor gave way to a hidden space, a crawl area that had never appeared on any blueprint. Lantern light revealed a network of tunnels beneath the foundation, narrow and uneven, as though carved by hand. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, heavier, thicker, with a faint humming that seemed to vibrate through the bones of those who entered. The walls were smeared with soot, and in some places the wood was scorched into the shape of handprints, as if someone had pressed against it during a fire that never consumed. At the end of the main passage, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. In the center stood a circle carved into the dirt, filled with charred candles and rusted chains, their links fused together. Above the circle hung remnants of rope tied in loops, swaying gently, though no breeze reached below. Ward found markings there, crudely written in chalk, dates, initials, and what appeared to be a tally, hundreds of vertical lines ending abruptly halfway down the wall. One of the men, a laborer named Thomas Keane, uncovered a second chamber branching off from the main one. Inside it lay several jars identical to those discovered in the barn years earlier, though these contained something worse. Suspended in the cloudy fluid were pieces of parchment, fragments of children's drawings, and beneath them a collection of small teeth arranged in perfect spirals. The air grew unbearable, thick with rot, and the faint metallic taste of decay. When Keane tried to leave, his lantern flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. For several seconds, the men heard what sounded like breathing. Slow, steady, close. They stumbled out, half crawling, and refused to return. Ward documented their findings but omitted the details of the sound, though his later diary entries described it as a pulse that seemed to echo from the soil itself, as though the earth remembered pain. On the final day of the inspection, Ward returned alone to sketch the tunnels. When he emerged hours later, he was pale, shaking, and refused to speak of what he had seen. He told the county to seal the house permanently and forbade anyone to dig again. The property records show that he resigned 2 months afterward and left Alabama without a trace. Years later, his notebook surfaced in a private archive. Its final pages contained erratic handwriting, as if written in panic. One passage described how the symbols beneath the floor aligned perfectly with the stars above on the night of the summer solstice, forming a pattern that mirrored the shape of the Crowhaven family crest. Another described a faint light seen moving through the tunnels, not flame, but phosphorescent, like breath turned visible. The last page bore only 3 words scrawled across it, over and over until the ink tore through the paper. They never left. After Ward's departure, the estate fell into complete ruin. Locals avoided it even in daylight, claiming that the ground around the house was soft, as though something moved just beneath the surface. Travelers who camped near the property reported waking to the sound of scraping beneath their tents, followed by whispers too faint to make out. Some swore they saw shapes beneath the ground at night, outlines of hands pressing upward through the soil before vanishing again. Decades passed, and the Crowhaven name slipped quietly into obscurity, but those who live near the remains still tell stories. They say the land breathes after rainfall, that the earth around the foundation trembles in rhythm, and that sometimes, if one kneels close enough, the faint sound of chains can still be heard rattling from below, as though whatever was sealed there still remembers the rituals carved beneath the floorboards.